Let me get my share screen in here. There we go. Okay, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my bandwidth today, so I may be a little choppy. I don't know what's going on with my, with the router in our building, but so
Yeah,
hopefully I'm not too choppy today.
No, it sounds good so far.
Okay, thank you. Well, welcome back. We've been talking about Western expansion, the American West, and the last few weeks we've been talking about the travels west and the migrant travels. And we've seen two of the main reasons why people traveled west. One of them, obviously, was economic. They wanted to improve their lifestyle and gather land and be able to make something out of themselves. There was another reason that we talked about last week, which was a religious reason. Actually, both parts, as shown by the Whitmans as they traveled west to establish a mission in Oregon. But more importantly, the escape from persecution is established by the Mormons that we talked about last week. There was another reason why people went west, and that was adventure. We've seen this already with the mountain men, how the mountain men went west primarily to escape the rigors and the boredom of the life of the East as they saw it. And so there was a group of people that went west that wanted to basically strike it rich. We knew there was mineral resources in the mountains, but we didn't know exactly how much until 1849. And in 1849, something occurred called the gold rush. I'm sure you've all heard of the 49ers, and not just an NFL football team, but the group of people that went west in an attempt to strike it rich in the gold fields. As always, I try to start my presentations with a painting. And this is by Alfred Rodriguez. It's called The Gold Rush of 49, and pretty realistic depiction of what it must have looked like in one of the gold fields. It was very simple. You took a pan, you picked up a bunch of gravel and sand, and you swirled it around. And the lead, being heavier than the sand, would settle to the bottom. Pardon me, the gold, being heavier than the sand, would settle to the gold, to the bottom, and they could pick the gold out of the pan. Later on, there were other ways with sluice bins and things like that, but at least in the beginning, most of them used just a simple pan and the swishing method. Now, we know that there was the Oregon Trail, and we've seen how there was the Mormon Trail west. Well, there was also the California Trail, which was nothing more than really just a break off of the Oregon Trail around the area called Fort Hall in Idaho. And it was a 525-mile, month-long trek across the Great Basin, which was a really hard place to get through until you got to the Humboldt River. Once you got to the Humboldt River, it was a little bit easier. Nevada mountains. Really difficult. Sierra Nevadas, as we talked about several times in my presentations, are the most rugged, the highest mountains in the continental United States, the hardest to get over. And it was a real challenge for pioneers to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains. There were a couple of passes. They were called the Truckee Pass and the Carson Pass. But both of them were very dangerous, and you absolutely could not cross over either of these passes in the winter. The snows were just very, very high, several feet high. I'm not talking 2 or 3 feet, I'm talking 15, 20 feet high in the passes. And it was absolutely disaster if you tried to cross over the Sierra Nevada mountains too late. once you got over the mountains, your destination was a place called Sutters Fort on the Sacramento River in Northern California. Uh, you had to be there by late November. If you got caught up in the mountains any later than that, you were over with. It was disaster. Here's a map of the trails again, and you can see the green map is the Oregon Trail that we've talked about. The blue map, the blue line is the Mormon Trail, and the red line followed part of the Oregon Trail till you got to Fort Hall, and then it crossed down parts of Utah into Nevada until you got to the mountains. And from there were 2 or 3 ways to do it, but most of them followed through this pass here, over to Sutters Fort. And the destination was Sutters Fort, and this is a replica of Sutters Fort that's been rebuilt as a tourist attraction, like they've done several different places. We looked at Bent's Fort a couple of weeks ago. Now, as I said, if you got to the mountains too late, it was disaster. There was no better example of this than the Donner Party. I'm sure you've all heard of the Donner Party at one time or the other, but it was absolutely the epitome of the disaster that struck if you got there late. It's pretty gruesome. To arrive in the Sierra Nevada mountains or Cascade Mountains in November meant certain disaster. 1846, a wagon train comprised primarily of 2 families, the Donners and the Reeds, although there were some other people, started late over the trail, and they were overloaded. They got to Fort Bridger late, and when they got there, they decided to try an untested shortcut to California. That didn't work out. And as a result, they got to the mountains about 30 days too late. It was too late. They should have stopped. Part of the problem was they were running out of food, and they knew if they didn't get across the mountains, they were probably reaching for definite starvation. So they took off across the mountains. They got stranded up in the Truckee Pass area, and the snows began to fall, and it was just an absolute disaster. Here's the Truckee Pass in the winter. This obviously isn't too snowfall because you can still see some of the bases of the trees. Well, what happened was this: it snowed for 2 weeks, and the 81 people in the Donner Reed Party, got stuck. 41 of them were children. They were trapped in the mountains. They were running out of food. They had temporary log shelters built, but they had no food. They couldn't find any food up there at all. The game had all left because of the snows, and it was just a disaster. As a result, even though there was a party that left and tried to get out of the mountains to get to a rescue party, which they did, unfortunately too late, it got so bad that after they began to eat their dogs and they chewed on but this is by far and away the most noted and the one that's probably the worst. It was just absolutely a disaster. And some of them journals, and this is a blog out of one of the journals, said Mrs. Murphy said here yesterday that she thought she would commence on Bill and eat him. It is distressing. Yes, it most certainly was. There's also the evidence that when the rescuers finally did get back, they found a pitiful little 5-year-old girl wailing beside a boiling pot, the remains of her mother in it. So it was a really disaster. These are the Reeds, James and Margaret. They actually survived. Once the story got out, it was really bad for them. People said, "How could you do that? How could this happen?" And they lost most of their friends. They lost their livelihood, and they actually ended up going on a touring circuit telling their story, like a sideshow. It was the only thing they could do for a while. And it was a really horrible situation for them, not to mention the ones that didn't make it. Now, there was another way around. You could take the passage. The passage was a water route, and you basically sailed around the Atlantic coast down around South America till you reach Cape Horn, crossed over Cape Horn, and sailed back up on the Pacific side till you got to California. Took about 6 months, about 13,000 miles, and it sounded a lot better than the passage on land. But in actuality, folks, it was a really horrible situation, particularly those that try to get around Cape Horn. Cape Horn is the most notorious stretch of water in the oceans. Uh, it's noted for its storms and its rugged seas, and the remnants of shipwrecks are just abundant on the Cape Horn area. Uh, there was another option. You could cross over the Isthmus of Panama. This was before the canal was built in the early 1900s, early 1900s, early 20th century, and it was about a 100-mile stretch across the isthmus, but you had to go through jungle and you risk wild animals, natives, not to mention disease, which was just really prevalent, yellow fever in particular. So the passage, although it sounded good, really wasn't that good of an area to get around. Most who traveled the passage said they regretted their journey and ended up being very envious of those that ended up taking the land route. This is a photograph of Cape Horn, and this was probably a pretty calm day. Like I said, it's really, really noted for its disastrous waters and shipwrecks. So, as I said, everybody wanted to get to Sutters Fort. Sutters Fort was in the northern part of California on the Sacramento River. John Sutter had reached California. Actually, he was a German originally. He reached there in 1839 and somehow persuaded the Mexican government to grant him 50,000 acres of land. And he built him up a ranch and a farm and a trading empire, and he kind of ruled it almost like a medieval lord. He almost had like a serf situation going on. In January of 1848, he had instructed one of his carpenters, a man by the name of John Marshall, to build a new sawmill. They needed a sawmill on the American River, which was on the tributaries of the Sacramento. And he said, why don't you go up and inspect the sawmill and see how it's going? He got up there and he looked down on the stream and he noticed yellow flakes. He knew immediately what he was seeing. He was seeing gold. And he tried to keep it a secret. He picked up some of the larger nuggets, but there were workers around, and no doubt they saw him doing it. And once they saw it, they understood exactly what he was doing. He went back to see Mr. Sutter and told him about the situation. And Sutter said, we've got to keep this quiet. If people find out there's gold here, they'll go crazy. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. The secret got out, mainly due to a man who wanted to publicize it, and I'll tell you about him in a minute. But this is an original photograph taken in 1849 of Sutter's Mill, and this is where the original gold strike first happened. That's Mr. Sutter, or pardon me, Mr. Marshall down there in the small figure at the bottom of the photo. So invariably, the word got out, and it began to spread up and down California, mainly because of the efforts of a man by the name of Sam Brannan. Sam Brannan, like so many others, figured out really rapidly that the gold wasn't going to be the source of real profits. Gold miners, for every one that strikes it rich, there's probably several thousand that never hardly get anything out of the gold strikes. The people that really struck it rich are the entrepreneurs, the people that end up selling the hardware, the groceries, the land, the items that are needed to all the miners that come out there to do it. And Sam Brandon was one of those men. And he started a hardware store, which sold the hardware equipment to these early miners. And he absolutely made a fortune. So it was to his advantage to publicize this gold strike. And he went around putting ads in papers, telling reporters about the gold strike, and it spread all the way back to the eastern part of the United States, to the point there where in the winter of 1848, President Polk actually had to address Congress about it and tell Congress that the strike was real. And once he did that, the rush was on. People just went nuts. There's something about gold that just brings out the animal in some people. And people all over the eastern part of the United States headed west, got there any way they could. And it was just massive. Many people went there. A lot of them came back penniless. Some of them didn't come back at all. Jesse and Frank James' father, who was a minister, actually left his family to go to the gold fields and never returned. Nobody knows exactly what happened to him. Most people assume he was killed in one way or the other, or died of a disease or something. It ended up being the greatest, the most anarchic gold rush in the history of the world. And this is a photograph of one of the early 49ers. I'm sure there were photographers out there that set up, that took their picture. And this is one of the streams, and you can see a guy here. He's down there with his pan, trying to find the gold flakes. And like I said, most of them never really saw any gold. And if they did, they were just very small amounts. There were, of course, some that did. And those are the ones that really struck it rich and made the fortune. Look at this. Between 1849, California's population, and we're talking about American population here, rose from 20,000 to 100,000, 5 times in 1 year. By 1852, there was 250,000 people in California. So within 3 years, the population had gone from 20,000 to 250,000, almost entirely due to the gold strikes. And they just flooded the state. Of course, there really was gold. And like I said, those that got there first and got to the big strikes made a fortune. But most of them really didn't make much at all. It was people like Brandon, the entrepreneurs, that really made the money in the long run. Sutter himself, his land was overrun. He lost most of it. The American government didn't recognize most of his land grant from the original Mexican government. And as a result, he really ended up losing almost everything. He was not able to keep much of his land at all. Marshall, the man that actually found it, died penniless. He never saw anything out of it. But the 49ers had a saying. They had seen the elephant. It was something they had never experienced before. That was a term that was used throughout the 19th century. And anytime anybody saw something that they never thought they'd ever see, they used to say, well, I've seen the elephant. And because most people in America thought they would never see it. They'd seen photographs or drawings of elephants, but they never in their minds imagined actually seeing one. Which, by the way, brings us to P.T. Barnum. And one of his great things was to bring elephants to different cities during his circus, and people love that. Here's another photograph of people working the claim. And you can see there's some colorization going on here. Someone's actually hand colored parts of it. And this again was pretty typical of what went on during the gold strike. Now, the gold camps themselves were just wild places. There were over 200 different gold camps on the Sacramento River and the tributaries that flowed into it. And hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold were found, again, by not very many people. uh, Poker Flats, Indian Bar, Red Dog, Hangtown, Liars Flat, just some of the different overnight boom towns. They would boom up and be thousands of people. They in turn were followed by the gamblers, the bartenders, the fancy ladies, the merchants. And these places were just wild, crazy places. They were also surprisingly places of equality. You saw a lot of different races here: Mexicans, Chinese, free blacks. Uh, there were a lot of different races that were there here, and they all kind of lived along together. It was actually amazing that there weren't more racial problems than there were. When there was a problem, since there really was no organized government as such, lynch law prevailed, and it happened quite a bit. If somebody got out of line, they would lynch them. Slaves were absolutely not allowed. Free blacks, that was a different story, but slaves were not allowed. And since California kind of was a mecca of abolition, they absolutely looked down on anybody that tried to bring in slaves they thought that was an equal opportunity, and they drove them out. They would not let the slave owners use slaves to get into the gold strikes. Another photograph, this is one of the gold camps. This was pretty typical. Again, you can see the shanties, and these were probably actually pretty good ones compared to some of them. The big winner in all these towns, these gold camps, was San Francisco. Now, when San Francisco was just a sleepy little old town on the harbor of about 800 in 1848. By 1850, it had grown to 55,000 people. Okay, I want you to stop and think of that about for a second. I've lived in a little community not far from here most of my life that when I was growing up, it was about 1,000 to 1,500 people, and now it's about 15,000. But that took about 50 years to get there. San Francisco went from 800 to 55,000 in 2 years. I can't even imagine how the town could have looked. And to be very honest, the town wasn't a very good town. In fact, Kate, the nickname for San Francisco at this time was Babylon on the Pacific. They did a little census in 1853. It had 48 brothels, 537 saloons, 144 restaurants, and 46 gambling dens. Unbelievable. I mean, I think we can see why it was called Babylon on the Pacific. It was just an unbelievable town. Like the Cowboys 2 decades later, that we'll talk about in a few weeks, the prospectors would work all year trying to raise a little bit of gold and go into town and spend their money in about 2 weeks worth of time and end up turning around, going back to the gold camp and doing it all over again. One observer, this is a quote I found in the book. It said, "I've seen pure whiskey, better cigars, finer tobacco, truer guns, larger bowie knives, and prettier prostitutes in San Francisco than anywhere else on earth." I guess that was something to brag about. I don't know. you know, I've never been to San Francisco, but I understand it's still a pretty wild town. So, but anyway, San Francisco was the big winner in all this. And you can see this is a very early photo of San Francisco in 1851. Of course, San Francisco was later destroyed in 1906 during the earthquake, which, by the way, the earthquakes did not really destroy San Francisco. It was the fires that broke out afterwards. The earthquake was devastating, but a lot of buildings withstood the earthquake. It was the fires that broke out that burned the city down in about 3 days after the earthquake. Now, of course, the gold could only last for so long in Sacramento, American River area of the gold fields around Sutters Fort. And once it was gone, the rush was on to try to find more gold. Once people figured out how much mineral resources were out here, they said, well, there's got to be more. And so, sure enough, the prospectors headed into the Sierra Nevadas, into the Rocky Mountains, trying to find more gold or silver. And they did. And between 1853 and 1900, there were just a continual line of gold strikes throughout the United States. Arizona, of course, you've all heard of Tombstone. Tombstone was a silver strike. Nevada, Carson City, Virginia City, Colorado, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, the state of Washington, South Dakota, Deadwood, South Dakota. And of course, the last big gold strike was the Alaskan Klondike in the later part of the 19th century. And it was here that, one of the bigger strikes, and just it was almost as large, really, as that of the San Francisco or the Sutters Mill gold strike. Pattern repeated itself over and over again. Few miners would make a fortune, but the real people that made the fortune were the merchants, the gamblers, the saloon owners. The biggest strike of all these gold silver strikes, the biggest strike of all was found in the eastern foothills of the Sierra Nevadas and around a little town called Virginia City, Nevada. If you've all watched Bonanza, you know that the Cartwrights lived on the Ponderosa, and the Ponderosa was a ranch on the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, right close to Virginia City, where the gold mines were and the silver strikes. And this is a photograph of Virginia City, Nevada at its height. And you can see some of the miners down here standing around. It looks like they're standing actually on some roofs. I'm not for sure, but it looks like it. And you can see some of the different mines down through here. The biggest strike of all in Virginia City was the Comstock lode. A man by the name of Old Henry Old Pancake Comstock was panning for gold when he found an unbelievable vein of gold and silver. I mean, it was several feet thick. And when he found it, I'm sure his eyes must have got as big as ping pong balls. Unfortunately, he never made very much money out of it. He sold his strike to some other people at what he thought was a lot of money. I think, as I recall, someone offered him $50,000 for the strike, which was a fortune back in those days. But compared to the hundreds of millions of dollars they've got out of the Comstock lode, it was nothing. Within a year, about 10,000 new miners were in Virginia City trying to strike it rich. And again, it really wasn't the miners that got rich. It was the speculators, the people that bought the land and sold mining claims, or the grocers or the hardware salesmen. One of these guys was the name of George Hurst. George Hurst made hundreds of millions of dollars speculating in land out of the Virginia City area. And he ended up being the father of a man by the name of William Randolph Hearst, who, of course, was the largest newspaper man of the 20th century. And the Hearst newspaper chain and magazine chain is still one of the largest in America yet today. And this is where the Hearst family got their riches, from the Comstock lode. That over the next 3 decades, the deep vein of ore produced $300 million worth of silver and gold. And that's in 19th century money, folks. That would be a whole lot more today. Pardon me while I get a drink here, okay? Unfortunately, it took a lot of effort to get the gold out of the Comstock lode. And this is some of the miners of the Comstock lode. I want you to look carefully here. Look at the little child down here. He was a miner. You know, we don't think about this, but the mines were so deep and the tunnels often so shallow and so narrow that they actually used children a lot to get into the mines, because some of these bigger guys couldn't fit into these narrow tunnels. So they would use their children or hire children out. This was the day before child labor laws. And again, this was not unusual. They did this in coal mines. They did it in Europe. It wasn't just an American thing. So I don't want you to think that, but this was not unusual at all to use children in these gold mines. Um, and it's a pretty tragic thing. Of course, a lot of them lost their life. It was an extremely dangerous job with cave-ins and all. Now, immediately, once the gold strikes was on, there was a desire for communications. You got to think about this. California, Oregon, later on the state of Washington, were states by 1850, but they were separated by the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevadas and the Great Basin and the Great Plains, which were all territories. They weren't occupied for the most part, except for a few rugged individuals. So all of a sudden, you've got a vast, large population on the west coast of the United States, who were part of the United States as states, and yet there was no communication between them and the rest of the country. So there was a real need for communication, and not to mention rapid transportation. So this is the beginning of the transportation communication era. And we're going to see this reach its climax next week with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was one of the great feats of all time, really. One of the civil engineering feats of history, really. It became apparent that there needed to be something done rapidly. And they were arguing about a railroad even in the 1850s, but building a railroad is a big deal. They needed something faster and something that could take place. So there began to be stagecoach routes developed. And the first one was really the California Stage Company that traveled all over the parts of California and Oregon and Washington, about 2,000 miles of routes. But that didn't help getting mail and communications back to the East Coast. So by 1856, there was a petition going to Congress to establish an overland stagecoach route. And although there was a lot of different arguments about it, mainly due because was it going to be in the South? Was it going to be in the North? And this all had to do with sectional rivalry and slavery. Finally, they reached a compromise and they built what became known as the Overland Stagecoach Company. And this is a photograph of one of the very early stagecoaches and the horses pulling it. And as you can see, people riding on top. Actually, this looked like buffalo soldiers on top. These were black soldiers that were being transported to a fort, probably. And there were people inside these coaches. They would hold anywhere from 15 to 30 people. I know that sounds unbelievable, but it would. Can you imagine riding that cramped of quarters and how smelly it must have been, and the food? It must have been really bad, but it was a really, good situation in that there you finally at least got transportation halfway rapidly there. Plus, you could get letters back and forth. The Butterfield Overland Stage Company was the first one. 1857, the Postmaster General awarded it to John Butterfield. There's a little community not far from Springfield, Missouri, where I'm located, called Butterfield, Missouri, and it was on the route of the stagecoach route. If you come to Springfield, right in the on the town square, there's where the History Museum is now, was the original Butterfield Stagecoach Company depot. And basically Butterfield said, I'm going to drive a stagecoach twice weekly between San Francisco and a little town in northwest Missouri called Tipton, Missouri. And he was going to travel on what he called an oxbow route, which was kind of a north-south configuration of about 2,500 miles. And he said, I'm going to do this in 25 days. And people said, you cannot do it. You cannot meet your contract. There's no way you can get mail delivered on this oxbow route in 25 days. Well, he proved him wrong. And in proving it in 1858, he himself helped drive a stagecoach, arrived at Tipton, Missouri in 24 days and 18 hours from San Francisco. Unbelievable. I mean, this was compared to 6 months, which is what it typically took to get across the western part of the United States. He did it in 24 days. And this began to be the origins of the big stagecoach companies. And this is an original Butterfield stagecoach. As you can see, it was very decorative. This one's been actually obviously restored. And they carried people on top. They crammed them inside. There was usually a man that back here, and of course, two men up here, the driver plus a what they call a shotgun man. And this thing would carry anywhere from 15 to 30 people. They just crammed them in here like crazy. And there was also one other really famous experiment in transportation and communications before the railroad called the Pony Express. Pony Express is one of those stories that captures the imagination of people, but it's actually very short-lived, only lasts for about 18 months. It was started in St. Joseph, Missouri by a freighting company called Russell, Waddell, and Majors. And they said, we think we can get the mail done even faster. We think we can do it in 10 days. And people said, there's no way you can get the mail delivered from St. Joe, Missouri to San Francisco in 10 days. And he said, I think I can do it. And they set about establishing a series of Pony Express stations all across the western part of the United States. Each one would have horses, fresh riders. And what they would do, they would ride the horse for as far as they could, usually 10 to 15 miles, would reach another station, would change horses. The riders themselves would usually ride about 80 to 100 miles. And that was about as far as they could go. And then they would change riders. And I'm sure you've all seen pictures of these in television or movies where it was done very rapidly. And over this 18 months, the riders rode about 650,000 miles, carried 35,000 pieces of mail, and according to the Pony Express Museum, they only lost one bag. I have to tell you, that's probably better than our post office today. Yeah, I'm still waiting for mail from before Christmas. So I don't know about you, but I still haven't got my stimulus check, and I'm waiting for it. So, but anyway, it usually took about 10 days. The record ride only took about 7 days and 17 hours. Wow, 7 days to cross the western part of the United States. That's really a pretty remarkable feat if you think about it. I've driven west, and it takes about 3 to 5 days to travel across the United States in a vehicle on roads. Can you imagine doing it in 7 days by horseback? Just unbelievable, really. Johnny Fry was the first rider. There were some pretty famous people were Pony Express riders. The most notable was probably Buffalo Bill, a little 15-year-old kid. And he was also one of the earliest, but he's not the famous. Wild Bill Hickok was not a Pony Express rider, like a lot of people think. He did run a overland stagecoach depot in Nebraska, and that's where he gained a lot of his fame. But he was not a Pony Express rider. Unfortunately, the venture didn't make any money. It sounded great. It was revolutionary. It captured the imagination of the people, but it went broke. And so it only lasted about 18 months. So here's some of the Pony Express riders. This is a man by the name of Billy Richardson. This is Johnny Fry. Everyone agrees he was probably the first Pony Express rider. He was the first one. There's a couple of brothers, Charles Cliff and Gus Cliff. Pretty rugged looking crew there, but and they would have been small. They would not have been big men at all. In fact, the case that was almost one of the requirements. You had to be very, very small and very lightweight because they didn't want a big man on these horses because they'd wear the horses out faster. They also preferred orphans because it was a dangerous job, and they said. In fact, there's a real famous book written about the Pony Express, and the title of it is called Orphans Preferred. So here's a painting by Frederick Remington of the Pony Express Riders. And you can see, here's a guy that he's changed horses and he takes off on a new horse. And like I said, they went about 10 miles. That's about all that the horse could go before they would wear out. So they had a station about every 10 miles, depending upon the land. The more rugged the land got, the less they could go. So if it was on flat land out in the plains, they might go 15 to 20 miles. But for the most part, they had to stay pretty much to a 10 to 15 mile route. I always recommend a book. And one of the best books on the gold rush of California was written by a man by the name of H.W. Brands. He's written a lot of different books about the American West. And he wrote a book about the Western gold rush called The Age of Gold, the California Gold Rush and the New American Dream. It's a really, really good book. I've read it. It's one of the best books about the gold rush, and I would highly recommend it if you're interested. As far as movies, there's not any really big movie written about the gold rush, but Clint Eastwood did make a movie that was set in the gold fields. It was called Pale Rider. And our group here watched it last Thursday, and it is a typical Clint Eastwood movie. He's a minister, and he arrives at a gold camp to minister to the gold miners and ends up being their hired gun. It's a little violent, to say the least, which is not untypical of Clint Eastwood movies. If you ever watch one, you know they tend to be a little violent, but it's a really good movie. And the group here that we watched, they really enjoyed it. They thought it was a really good representation. It does show the gold fields pretty well. So that's it for today. Next week, we're going to talk about one of the greatest feats of engineering ever done, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And it is a really interesting story about how they built this railroad in just a few years all across the United States. And once they did, the West just blew up. I mean, people by the hundreds of thousands begin to flood into the West once the railroads got there. It also brought about the cattle age, the cow towns, and the people begin to, the cattle drives north to Dodge City and Ellsworth, Kansas, which will be what we'll talk about next. And that in turn brought about the Wild West, which I'm sure you'll all be interested in when we start talking about the old gunfighters and the outlaws. That's when it really gets interesting. So I'm done for the day, Kayla.